It was a foggy morning in Prague, the kind that curled in the corners of ancient streets, swallowed the spires of towering cathedrals, and obscured the distant hills. Dr. Elias Winter, a geneticist who had spent his life unraveling the mysteries of the human genome, sat in his small apartment, staring at the letter on his desk. The elegant script on the paper was familiar, yet its contents felt impossible, even for a mind accustomed to the wonders of science. The letter was an invitation from a prestigious research institute in the heart of Europe, known for its secrecy and the mysterious studies that took place within its walls. They wanted him. No, needed him. The proposal sounded like something from a nightmare rather than a legitimate scientific inquiry. A group of children, each with no family, raised in a hidden compound. And they had a strange ability: they could see and communicate with souls. Not ghosts but something else. Entities from another realm. Elias had heard rumors of such things, whispered in the darker corners of academia, stories about souls crossing into different dimensions, about beings who existed on the cusp of the living and the dead. But he had always dismissed them as superstition, as the fantasy of those who could not accept the finality of death. Yet here in this letter the impossible was being offered as truth. A shiver crept down his spine as he considered the implications. Was it possible that the boundaries between life and death were not as rigid as he had been taught? That the dead did not simply cease to exist but lingered in another world, waiting, perhaps, to return? And what could these children, these strange orphan children, teach him about this? With a sigh, he placed the letter down and looked out the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Something deep inside him stirred. This invitation was more than a scientific opportunity, it was a beckoning into the unknown, into a place where the rules of reality were rewritten. And the cold, dark fog that swirled outside his window seemed to echo the very atmosphere of the institute, the sense of something hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The journey to the research institute was long and arduous, taking him through remote villages, their twisted lanes barely lit by the weak afternoon sun. The further he went, the more the landscape seemed to change, the trees growing taller and more gnarled, as if reaching for the sky in silent warning. It was as though the land itself was trying to protect its secrets. When he finally arrived, the institute stood before him like a fortress, an imposing structure of stone and iron, shrouded in mystery. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the very building was holding its breath. He was greeted by Dr. Amelia Krupp, the director of the institute, whose presence was both warm and unsettling. She spoke with an air of authority, her every word carefully measured. "Dr. Winter, we're glad you could make it," she said, her eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity. "I trust the journey was enlightening?" Elias nodded, though he felt anything but enlightened. There was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't just the isolation, it was the weight of history, the presence of things long buried and forgotten. Amelia led him through the corridors of the institute, each one dimly lit, the walls adorned with strange abstract paintings that seemed to twist and contort as he passed. They came to a large door and she motioned for him to enter. Inside, a group of children sat quietly in a circle, their pale faces lit by the soft glow of a single lamp. They were watching him intently as though they had been waiting for him. "They are special," Amelia said softly, her voice carrying a tone of reverence. "These children, they are not like others. They have seen things that most cannot even imagine." Elias stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The children did not speak, but their eyes followed him with an intensity that sent a chill through his bones. They were all so still, as if trapped in a world of their own, and yet their gaze held a knowing depth that suggested they saw far more than they should. One of them, a girl with dark eyes and raven-black hair, stood and walked towards him. "You will help us," she whispered, her voice soft but certain. Elias froze. There was something in her voice, something that seemed to echo deep within him, as though she were speaking directly to his soul. Before he could respond, the room darkened, and a shadow seemed to creep across the walls. The air grew colder, and the faintest whispering filled the room, voices, distant and ethereal, murmuring in a language he could not understand. Dr. Krupp's voice broke the silence. "This is why we need you, Dr. Winter. These children, these souls, they are connected to something much older than our world. And they need to be freed." As the whispers grew louder, Elias felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. This was no ordinary research. This was something far beyond science. Something that straddled the line between life and death. And as the shadows in the room began to move as if alive, Elias realized that his life would never be the same again. The night had fallen heavy over the institute, blanketing everything in an unnatural silence. Elias sat alone in a dimly lit office, the same room where he had been briefed earlier. He had requested some time to collect his thoughts after the unsettling encounter with the children. The cold stone walls seemed to press in on him, as if the building itself were alive, watching, waiting. The faintest sound echoed from the halls, whispers just beyond his hearing, like murmurs floating through the ancient air. His skin prickled with unease. He looked out the window, but the mist outside had only thickened, rendering the world beyond the glass a ghostly blur. The shadows outside seemed to shift, just like the ones that had moved in the children's room. Something was amiss in this place, and it was slowly suffocating him. Elias's mind raced. He could not shake the image of the children's eyes. Those dark, empty eyes that seemed to peer into his very soul. And that girl, the one who had spoken to him. Her words lingered in his mind, echoing with a quiet, dreadful certainty. "You will help us." He had tried to dismiss it as a childish statement, but there had been an unshakable conviction in her voice, a knowledge far beyond her years. The way she had spoken suggested that she knew more about him than he could ever know about her. The hairs on his neck stood on end. The door to the office creaked open, and Dr. Krupp stepped inside, her face shadowed by the dim light. Her presence was always unnerving, like a specter from another world, and tonight, that unease seemed heightened. "Dr. Winter," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with something darker. "I see you're still processing everything. We've all been where you are at some point." Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared out the window, watching as the mist curled around the building like a living thing, its tendrils slithering under the doorframe. He felt the temperature drop sharply. "The children," he said, his voice unsteady. They're not like normal children, are they?" Amelia's smile was cold. "No, they are not. And that's why you're here." Elias turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "They're connected to something else," she explained, stepping closer to him. "Something ancient. The world they inhabit, it's not bound by the same rules as our own. The spirits they communicate with, they're not simply ghosts. They're entities from a parallel realm, a place where the souls of the departed can exist indefinitely. And these children, they've become their vessels." Elias felt a chill grip his heart. "Vessels?" "Yes," she replied, her voice lowering. "The children can see the spirits because they have been marked by them, bound to them. The souls cling to them, using their energy to remain in our world. The more they communicate with these entities, the more they are connected to this other place. But this connection is a curse." Elias felt his stomach tighten. "So what? You want me to study them, figure out how to sever the link?" Amelia's eyes flickered with something unsettling, something that reminded Elias of a predator watching its prey. "It's not that simple," she said softly. "The link can't simply be severed. The children, if they are ever cut off from their souls, will cease to exist. But they've been chosen. We believe they are the key to something much larger. Something that could unlock the gateway between worlds." She paused, her gaze never leaving him. "And you, Dr. Winter, are the one who can help them." Elias's mind spun, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because," Amelia said, her smile widening, "you are the one who can understand. You are the one who knows the science behind the impossible. You're the one who can make sense of what the others could not." Before Elias could respond, a soft knock on the door interrupted them. Amelia turned, and her smile disappeared. She moved toward the door and opened it just a crack, letting a faint glow from the hall spill into the dark room. A small figure, one of the children, stood just beyond the threshold. The child was no more than 10, his face pale, eyes wide with an unnatural light. Elias could feel the weight of his gaze even from where he stood. It was as if the child could see right through him, to the very core of his being. "Is everything all right?" Elias asked, trying to steady his voice, though his heart pounded in his chest. The child didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, holding something in his hands, a small silver locket. The boy placed it gently on Elias's desk, his small fingers brushing against the papers scattered there. "This is for you," the child said, his voice barely a whisper. "It will help you understand." Elias reached out to take the locket, but as his fingers closed around it, the child stepped back, his expression unchanged. "Don't open it," the child whispered before turning and walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the hall. Elias stared after him, heart pounding. What did he mean? Why shouldn't he open it? Amelia closed the door softly, her face unreadable. "It's time," she said, her voice oddly distant. "It's time for you to meet them." With a sudden surge of dread, Elias stood up, the locket still cold in his hand. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of something ancient and forgotten. He followed Amelia down the narrow hallways of the institute, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers grew louder, louder still, until they became an unearthly cacophony, swirling around him, brushing against his skin like 1,000 ghostly fingers. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching, distorting into shapes that should not have been. They stopped before a heavy door, its surface marked with strange symbols. Amelia placed her hand on the cold iron handle, and the door creaked open. Inside, the children sat in a circle once more, but now their eyes were wide, unblinking. They stared at Elias with a gaze that seemed to pierce him, stripping away his very humanity. The air was thick with a presence, something ancient, something beyond time. One of the children, the girl from earlier, rose and stepped toward him, her voice a mere whisper, but it felt as though the words resonated in his bones. "You will understand soon, Dr. Winter," she said. "The truth of this place. The truth of who we really are." As she spoke, Elias felt a cold gust of wind sweep through the room, the whispers escalating into a frantic rush of voices. The walls seemed to tremble. He looked at the children, and their eyes, they weren't just looking at him anymore. They were looking through him, as if seeing into a place where he had no right to be. The girl's voice echoed again, but this time, it was not just her voice. "We are the children of the night. And you are the one who will open the door." Suddenly the room plunged into darkness. The whispers intensified, rising to a deafening crescendo, until Elias felt his sanity begin to fray at the edges. And then all at once there was silence. The room was still. The children were gone. Elias was left standing alone in the darkness, the locket still gripped tightly in his hand, as a single word echoed in his mind. "Run." But it was too late. Elias stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale a struggle as the heavy silence pressed in on him from all sides. He stood in the center of the darkened room, the cold walls closing in around him, and the only sound was the blood rushing in his ears. The children were gone, vanished into thin air as if they had never existed, leaving behind only the thick, suffocating silence that seemed to swallow everything. His hands trembled, the silver locket still pressed against his palm, its surface cold and smooth, like the dead heart of a forgotten god. The whispers, those maddening whispers, were gone, but their echoes lingered, haunting him. They felt like a part of him now, embedded deep within his psyche. The words, the voices, the feeling of being watched, they were no longer distant, no longer something he could dismiss as a product of his mind playing tricks on him. He glanced around the room, his eyes straining to see through the blackness. But there was nothing. Just shadows and the oppressive weight of the silence pressing down on him. He took a step forward, then another, each footfall a tentative exploration into the unknown. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. His senses felt heightened, every sound amplified in the vast emptiness. As he moved toward the door, his mind raced. What had just happened? Had he imagined the whole thing? The children, what had they meant by their words? "We are the children of the night." It was a cryptic statement, one that gnawed at him like a splinter lodged deep in his mind. And the girl, her voice, the way she spoke, it hadn't sounded human. The door to the room creaked open and Elias stepped into the hallway. The long, dark corridor stretched before him, lit only by the faint glow of distant lamps. But the place felt different now, strange, like something had shifted. The walls seemed to press in closer, and every step he took made the air grow heavier. It was as if the building itself had become aware of his presence, watching him, waiting. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. He turned quickly, but there was nothing. Only the empty hall, the strange symbols carved into the stone, the old paintings on the walls. All of them were distorted in the dim light, their shapes shifting as though they too were alive. Elias's mind raced. The children, those children, had to know something. They weren't normal, that much was clear. And their connection to the spirits, or whatever they were communicating with, was something beyond his understanding. He had to learn more. But what was it that Amelia had said? Unlock the gateway between worlds. Was that what this place was really about? Had the institute been built to study the boundary between the living and the dead, or was there something even darker at play? Elias pressed on, his feet moving faster now, driven by an urgent need to understand. He rounded a corner, the echo of his steps ringing through the silence. He passed doors that led to empty rooms, their wooden panels worn and splintered, as if they had been abandoned for years. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to deepen, thickening around him like tendrils reaching for his soul. He arrived at a door at the far end of the hall, its surface covered in the same strange symbols as the room where he had met the children. It stood slightly ajar as if inviting him inside. A faint, ghostly glow leaked through the crack. Elias hesitated. He could feel it now, the pull, the magnetic force drawing him forward, urging him to enter. He had no choice. He had to know what was on the other side. He pushed the door open. The room was larger than the others, its stone walls lined with ancient bookshelves filled with worn leather-bound tomes. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its frame covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change when he looked at them. The mirror's surface was dark, like a pool of ink, reflecting nothing but the shadows of the room around it. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why, but something about the mirror felt wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. As he stepped closer, the faintest whisper reached his ears, like the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The voice was distant, barely audible, but it seemed to come from the mirror itself. "Come closer." He froze. The voice, it wasn't one of the children. It was something else. Dark. Ancient. The whisper came again, louder this time, and Elias felt the floor beneath him tremble, the ground shifting as if the very foundation of the building was alive. "Come closer. See what lies beyond." His breath hitched in his throat, but he couldn't look away. It was as if the mirror was calling to him, pulling him in, urging him to understand. To see what he had been unable to see until now. He stepped forward, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold surface of the mirror. The moment he touched it, the world around him seemed to bend, warping as though the mirror itself was a portal to something else. A vast, endless void stretched before him, and in that darkness, he saw shapes moving, figures that were not human. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the air, piercing the silence with a sound that tore at his very soul. Elias recoiled, stumbling back, his heart racing as the room began to spin. The mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, and in that moment, something reached out. A cold hand gripped his wrist. He looked down, but no one was there. The darkness seemed to consume him, pulling him deeper into the void, and for the briefest of moments, Elias was sure he had crossed the line between life and death. The air grew thick with a suffocating presence, the whispers growing louder, drowning out all rational thought. Then everything stopped. The room returned to normal, and Elias found himself back where he started, standing in front of the mirror, his hands still hovering in the air. His heart was pounding in his chest, his body drenched in cold sweat. But something had changed. He could feel it. The mirror was no longer just a reflection, it was a doorway. A gateway to something far older, far darker than anything he had ever imagined. And it was calling to him. He stepped away from the mirror, his mind reeling, and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, he heard the faintest sound, like a soft footfall echoing behind him. He spun around. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the pale light from the hall, was one of the children. It was the girl again. But her eyes were different this time, cold, empty, like the eyes of a ghost. And in her hands she held the locket. She raised it slowly, offering it to him. "You are the key," she whispered, her voice hollow. "You have opened the door." Before he could react, the girl disappeared, vanishing into the shadows as if she had never been there. And in that moment, Elias understood. The gateway between worlds had been unlocked. And there was no turning back. Elias stood frozen in the doorway, the words of the girl echoing in his mind like a broken record. "You have opened the door." He glanced down at the locket she had left behind, still held out before him as though inviting him to take it, to unlock the next piece of the puzzle. The room seemed to spin, and the walls around him felt suddenly far too close. His heart hammered in his chest, and his breath came in short, shallow bursts. The silence that had enveloped him earlier had returned, but now it felt different, thick, heavy with an unspoken tension, as though the very air in the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted and writhed, dark forms stretching and folding in unnatural ways, as if they were alive and moving. For a moment, Elias wondered if he was going mad. The sensations he was experiencing were beyond any explanation he could offer. The mirror, the whispers, the girl, everything felt like a fever dream, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But it was real. He could feel it deep in his bones. Something had shifted in him, something had changed. He had crossed a line. The door had been opened, and now there was no turning back. His gaze moved back to the locket, still resting on the edge of the desk. It was no longer just a simple object. It had become a key, a symbol of his new reality. He had been chosen. For what purpose he still wasn't sure. But the girl's words rang in his ears, the truth of them cutting through the haze of his thoughts. You are the key. Elias took a slow, hesitant step toward the locket. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and as he picked it up, he felt a surge of energy course through him. It was faint at first, like an electric current just beneath his skin, but it quickly grew stronger, an unrelenting force that pulled him deeper into the mystery. Without thinking, he opened the locket. Inside was an image, faded with age, an old photograph of a woman, her features soft and delicate. But it wasn't just the woman that caught his attention. It was the symbol etched into the back of the locket, a symbol that seemed eerily familiar. It was the same symbol that had been carved into the walls of the institute, the one he had seen earlier in the room with the children. A surge of dread coursed through Elias's veins. The woman in the photograph, he didn't know her, but there was something deeply unsettling about her. A sense of recognition, like he had seen her before, but in a place he couldn't remember. A sudden noise behind him snapped him from his trance. He turned quickly, heart pounding. There, standing in the doorway, was Dr. Krupp. Her expression was unreadable, but the look in her eyes was something darker, something ancient. You shouldn't have opened it, she said softly, her voice filled with an eerie calm. Elias's breath caught in his throat. What is this place? What are the children? Why did you bring me here? Amelia took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. The children are not what you think. They are vessels, beacons for something far older than you can comprehend. They are the bridge between our world and the one beyond. The souls they communicate with, they are not just spirits. They are remnants of a forgotten realm, a place where the boundaries between life and death have long since dissolved. Elias's mind reeled at her words. He had known something was wrong, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. The children were not innocent. They weren't simply communicating with ghosts or spirits. They were connected to something far darker, something that reached across time and space, a force that could not be contained. And the locket? Elias asked, his voice trembling. What does it have to do with all of this? Amelia's lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. The locket is a key, Elias. A key to unlocking the truth. The woman in that photograph is the one who first discovered the connection between our world and the one beyond. She was the first to make contact, the first to understand what the children have always known. She was also the first to die. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to her? Amelia's eyes darkened. She crossed the threshold. She opened the door fully, allowing what lies beyond to come through. And when she did, she vanished. No one knew what happened to her, but we've been searching for answers ever since. She took another step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. The children are not just vessels, Elias. They are the guardians. They are the ones who keep the balance between the two worlds. But something is changing. Something is growing stronger. Elias swallowed hard. And I'm supposed to help? Yes, Amelia said, her tone eerily calm. You are the key. You have the ability to understand what the others could not. You have the scientific mind that can bridge the gap between our reality and theirs. You have the knowledge to bring everything into balance. But how? Elias asked, desperation creeping into his voice. How do I fix this? Amelia's gaze softened for the briefest of moments, and then she turned toward the door, her expression hardening. You have to find the truth. The children hold the answers, but they will not give them to you easily. They are bound to something ancient, something that even they do not fully understand. But you must ask the right questions. You must learn to listen to what they are truly saying. She paused for a moment, her voice taking on a darker edge. And remember, Elias, the door has already been opened. There is no turning back now. Before he could respond, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Elias standing alone with the locket, the photograph, and a growing sense of dread that gnawed at him from the inside out. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows creeping closer, whispering his name. He looked back at the mirror, the reflection now distorted in ways he hadn't noticed before. The image of the woman in the locket seemed to flicker, her face shifting between the living and the dead. Elias knew one thing for certain: the answers were out there. And whatever lay beyond the door, whatever it was that the children were keeping hidden, would stop at nothing to get what it wanted. He had already crossed the threshold. There was no going back now. The question was, how much of his soul was he willing to lose to uncover the truth? The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the reflection in the mirror, the woman's face, her eyes hollow and pleading. Every time he blinked, he heard the whispers, faint but insistent, like an insect buzzing just out of sight. It was a haunting sensation, one that clung to him like a second skin. He spent his days studying the locket, the photograph, the strange symbols etched into its surface. But no matter how hard he tried, the answers remained elusive. The locket had become a constant presence in his life, its cold weight hanging around his neck like a reminder that the door had been opened, and there was no going back. The children were a puzzle, one he had yet to solve. He had spoken to them only once more, during a brief encounter in the hallway, but they had been eerily silent, their eyes watching him with a knowing gaze. It was as if they understood something he didn't, something he wasn't yet ready to comprehend. They were quiet now, but Elias could sense the undercurrent of fear in their movements, the way they avoided certain rooms and whispered among themselves in hushed tones. There was one child, however, who seemed different from the others. Her name was Alina. She had dark, unruly hair that framed her face like a halo of shadows, and her eyes, those eyes, were the most unsettling Elias had ever seen. They were pale, almost translucent, as though she had seen things that no child should ever witness. It was Alina who first spoke to him in more than a whisper. It happened late one evening as Elias was walking down the dimly lit corridor outside his lab. He had been thinking about the locket again, tracing the strange symbol inside it with his fingers, when he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, and there she was, Alina, standing just a few feet away, her face unreadable, her eyes locked onto his. "Dr. Elias," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must listen to the song." He frowned, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What song?" "The song," Alina repeated, her voice more urgent now, though her expression remained eerily calm. "The one that calls to them. The one that lures them." Elias felt a shiver run down his spine. He had heard of the strange occurrences that plagued the children, how they would sometimes disappear into the night, drawn by a haunting melody that no one else could hear. But he had never paid much attention to the rumors. Now, standing in front of him, Alina's words seemed to carry an undeniable weight. "The song," he repeated, his voice strained. "Where does it come from?" Alina's eyes grew distant, and for a moment, Elias thought she was about to slip into one of her strange, detached silences. But then she spoke again, her voice low and solemn. "It comes from the forest," she said. "The one beyond the walls. The one no one dares enter." Elias felt a strange pull in his chest, an impulse to follow the thread of her words, to uncover the truth behind them. But he hesitated. He had spent so long buried in his research, trying to understand the science behind the phenomena he was witnessing, that he had neglected the old stories, the ones whispered in the dark corners of the institute, the ones the staff tried to keep hidden. "You want me to go into the forest?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Alina nodded slowly, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "Only then will you hear it," she said. "Only then will you understand what it wants. What it has always wanted." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway like a wisp of smoke. Elias stood there for a moment, his mind spinning. The forest. He had heard of it, an ancient, cursed place that lay beyond the boundaries of the Institute's grounds. The stories told of strange happenings in the woods, of people who entered and never returned, of a presence that lingered there, unseen but always watching. But he couldn't ignore what Alina had said. There was something about her words that felt like a warning, like a key to the next piece of the puzzle. The song. The forest. It was all connected. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dark, twisting trees of the forest, and heard the faintest echoes of a song, a melody so distant, so haunting, that it seemed to come from the very core of the earth itself. It was a sound that tugged at his soul, drawing him closer, pulling him into the darkness. The next day he made up his mind. He had to go. He had to find the forest, and he had to hear the song for himself. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. And Elias knew that the answers lay hidden there, in the heart of that cursed place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias slipped away from the institute, a small flashlight and his research notes in hand. He moved quietly, avoiding the main paths, his footsteps swallowed by the thick fog that had begun to creep in from the woods. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of earth and decay. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the call of distant birds, but there was something else, something more subtle, that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. The song. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the wind, but as he moved deeper into the woods, it grew louder, clearer, until it was all he could hear. The melody was strange, beautiful in its sadness, as though it carried with it a longing, a pain that transcended time. It was the kind of song that felt as if it had always existed, an ancient tune sung by forgotten voices. Elias's heart raced as he followed the sound, each step carrying him deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. And then through the trees he saw it, a clearing bathed in the soft light of the moon. In the center of the clearing stood a stone archway, old and weathered, its surface covered in moss and vines. The song seemed to emanate from beyond the archway, a soft, mournful melody that pulled at his very soul. He approached cautiously, the song growing louder, more insistent, as though it were calling his name. He stepped through the archway, and the air around him seemed to shift, the temperature dropping as a cold wind swept through the clearing. The song was deafening now, a chorus of voices singing in perfect harmony, their words unintelligible but filled with a deep, aching sorrow. And then, as if summoned by the music itself, figures began to appear in the clearing, shadowy shapes, their forms indistinct, flickering like candle flames. They moved slowly, drifting toward Elias, their faces obscured by the darkness. The song seemed to emanate from them, their voices blending with the haunting melody. Elias took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had crossed the threshold. The door was open, and the world he had entered was no longer his own. The figures moved closer, and in their midst Elias saw her. The woman from the photograph. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth parted as though singing along with the chorus of voices. But her gaze was fixed on him, and as she stepped forward, Elias felt the weight of 1,000 years of sorrow pressing down on him. And then she spoke. "You've come," she whispered, her voice as soft and cold as the wind. "You've come to open the door." Elias stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes from the woman before him. Her face was familiar, too familiar, but distorted like an image caught in a fevered dream. Her features were soft and sorrowful, but her eyes held an ancient emptiness, a weight that no mortal soul should ever bear. "You've come," she whispered again, her voice barely audible, but it reverberated through his entire being. "You've come to open the door." Elias's mind reeled. Every part of him screamed to turn back, to run, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. The forest around him seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the song, the voices growing louder, swelling in a dissonant harmony that tugged at his consciousness. He felt himself sinking deeper into the place, as though he were being swallowed by the very earth beneath his feet. "Who are you?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. The woman's lips curled into a sad, knowing smile. "I am the one who opened the door long ago. The one who brought the children here. The one who made the mistake." Elias's heart pounded in his chest. "The children? You mean?" "Yes," she interrupted, her voice softer now, more like a sigh. "They were never meant to be here. They were meant to be the bridge, the conduit between worlds, but they became something more, something we could not control." The air around Elias seemed to grow colder still, the shadows of the forest reaching toward him like fingers, pulling him into the depths of the clearing. The figures around him swirled, flickering between the living and the dead, their faces twisted in agony. The song swirled with them, its mournful tone thick with a grief that felt ancient, infinite. Elias struggled to breathe, his thoughts muddled by the overwhelming sensation that time itself was bending around him. The woman, the figure before him, stepped closer, and as she did, her form seemed to blur, becoming less solid, more like a wisp of smoke caught in the wind. "You opened the door when you entered," she said softly. "And now you must close it. The song will not stop until you do." The words fell upon him like a weight, and Elias understood then, the door had never been something physical, never something to be locked or shut. It had always been in his mind, in the hearts of those who sought to bridge the divide between life and death. The door had opened when the first child had crossed the threshold, when the first whisper had been heard, and it had remained open, tearing the fabric between worlds. "How do I close it?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. The woman's form flickered one last time before she spoke again, her voice barely a breath on the wind. "You must hear the final song. The one that ends all songs. The one that severs the bond. But be warned, Elias, the song will demand a sacrifice." Elias looked around him at the ghostly figures, their faces twisted in eternal torment. They were not souls at peace. They were the remnants of those who had crossed, who had died because they had listened to the call, and now they were forever trapped in the limbo between the worlds. He thought of the children, of Elena, of all of them, and a deep sorrow swept through him. He understood now. They were not victims. They were the guardians, the gatekeepers. They had been tasked with holding back the floodgates of the unknown, but they too were prisoners of their role. What is the sacrifice? Elias asked, dreading the answer. The woman smiled again, but it was not a smile of reassurance. It was the smile of someone who had long accepted their fate. Yourself, she whispered. Your soul. You must become the anchor that holds the door closed. You must sacrifice your essence, your very being, to ensure that the song fades and the worlds remain apart. The words hit Elias like a thunderclap, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to spin. He had come so far, had uncovered so much, and yet now, the truth laid bare before him, a truth that demanded a terrible price. He looked at the children, standing in the clearing now, their eyes empty, their faces as pale as the moonlight that bathed them. They were not here to help him, not here to guide him, they were bound by their fate just as he was now. He took a deep breath, the cold air biting at his skin. He understood then. It wasn't just the children who had been drawn into this world. It was him as well. He had opened the door and now he was the one who had to close it. The final song began to rise, slow and haunting, its melody stretching across time like a distant bell tolling for the end. Elias closed his eyes, and in that moment, the weight of the world pressed down upon him. He had spent his life seeking answers, seeking knowledge, but now he understood that some questions were never meant to be answered. With a single, final breath, Elias stepped into the song. The next morning when the staff at the institute awoke, there was no sign of Elias. His notes were gone, the research files vanished, and the children were silent, their faces vacant and still. The forest had swallowed him whole, and the song was no longer heard. The doors had closed, the veil had been lifted, and the bridge between worlds remained intact. The children, now free of their burden, could finally rest. But the forest still stood, dark and silent, its secrets buried deep within the earth. And the door? The door would remain closed for now. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental.